this episode, I am joined by Dr. Neil Manson of University of Mississippi, whose main area of expertise is design arguments for the existence of God, but this is by no means his only area of interest. He is also active in philosophy of science and environmental philosophy. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk. Thank you.
Now, before we begin, I always like to know a bit of personal history about the guests I have. So, in my experience, most people that I talk to that have somehow ended up being philosophers, they weren't really, set on becoming a philosopher. They kind of ended up as a philosopher. So, in my experience, people become interested in psychology or neuroscience, or they have these kind of questions in their mind, and philosophy just sparks their interest in the subject and they stick with it. So, could you please, first of all, provide us with a personal history and how and why did you become interested in philosophy in general, and why philosophy of religion in particular?
Thank you. So, when I was growing up, I lived in a town in Maryland called Annapolis, where they had a small college called St. John's College, and it has a very unusual program compared to most universities and colleges in the United States. They study what are called the great books. So it's Plato, Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, Hobbes, Locke. They would read Euclid's Elements to learn geometry, for example. I didn't go to this school, but I sat in on their seminars when I was in high school, and I thought that was really amazing. And so when I went to college, although I originally studied mathematics, I was always taking these philosophy and literature courses. And then towards the second half of my degree as an undergraduate college student, I went entirely to literature and philosophy. And I didn't know what to do afterwards. After college, I applied to PhD programs. I went to Syracuse University, and there were several people there who specialized in philosophy of religion. My dissertation advisor was Peter Van Inwagen, and another professor there was William Alston. And so, and then there were students there who went on to become big figures in philosophy of religion. Daniel Howard Snyder was there when I was there. John Hawthorne does some things in philosophy of religion. He was there, and several others. But there was just a lot of interest in philosophy of religion. When I had to write my dissertation, though, I originally wanted to write on just metaphysics, namely, why is there something rather than nothing? And Peter Van Inwagen said, well, why don't you look at a more specific topic, this fine-tuning argument? And I started looking at that, and it had so many interesting issues. It has metaphysics, but also epistemology in terms of things like the Anthropic Principle and observation selection effects. It has theology, because you have to ask, why would God create a universe like this? Obviously, there's a lot of science involved, and you have to talk about that and probability. So it was a really interesting array of topics. I ended up calling myself a philosopher of religion because once I finished my dissertation, that's where I started getting jobs under that description. And so I certainly specialize in philosophy of religion, but I would say the three things, philosophy of religion and metaphysics and some philosophy of science, all come up in the fine-tuning argument.
So it seems that this is a consistent trend in your case too, this shift.
Yes, I don't know anyone who knew they were going to be a philosophy professor when they were 14. You know, that does not happen.
Yes, this does seem to be the case. By the way, I wanted to do this interview earlier, but given the situation with COVID and my hectic schedule, there was a delay. But turns out that there's a bonus, because Dr. Manson's 2020 paper on multiverse is out, and we will be talking about that in the end. Now, turning back to fine-tuning, it seems no matter what your approach is, or where you're coming from to this whole arguments for the existence of God or the non-existence of God, fine-tuning turns out to be a pretty important development on the theistic side, especially since Hume wrote. So you have to really be familiar with this. So let's turning back to you and just tell us what is the fine-tuning argument and maybe a bit of history behind it.
Well, that's a very good question, and it will be a long answer because there are a lot of things going on. So permit me, I'll give you a history here. So sure. The design argument that you mentioned, where you mentioned David Hume, I think a terrific book is his book, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And it's almost, you should start there if you were looking at the design argument and comparing it to the book by William Paley, Natural Theology. So the design argument is not like other arguments for the existence of God, which are not really scientific, right? The ontological argument, it's purely concepts. The cosmological argument, it's very abstract. I mean, you don't really need a lot of science to know that there are things that exist that might not have existed, right? That's not very much science. But the design argument was supposed to look into the natural world and integrate science, using it to prove or at least give strong evidence that the world itself was produced by an intelligent being, that it couldn't have happened by chance. And when Hume was writing, most of that evidence was on the side of biology. It was just getting started. I think the discoveries that really fueled that early version of the design argument, it really reached its peak with Paley. But just all the discoveries in the natural world about you really kind of needed a microscope to see some of them, just how finely adjusted the eyes were, or wings, or all the structures in animals, right? That line of thinking goes back to ancient times, but it really took off in the 1700s, and that's what Hume was responding to. I think most people have some sense that argument really lost its force after Darwin. So I won't go into that whole history here, but you were right that there was this, there's been a resurgence or a new interest in this design argument, and how did that come about? I think you need to know that up until maybe 1930, perhaps, although it was emerging a little bit before then, but up until 1930, most people thought the design argument was finished, right? Darwin had shown that it was, you didn't need God to explain these things. Okay, so what changed? I think in the beginning of the 20th century, you had developments both in particle physics, and then especially you had the Big Bang Theory, and you had cosmology. So you now had, through cosmology, the idea that the universe itself was very specific, not vague. You could say, here's exactly how old it is. Here is how rapidly it is expanding. Here is the average amount of matter per cubic kilometer or whatever. And then you also had, from the small level of particle physics, you had the discovery of exactly how the parts of the atom are working and how nucleosynthesis works. Well, what came to be apparent through the 1950s and early 1960s, if I have the dates correct, is that in order for there to be any elements other than hydrogen and helium, they had to be produced inside of stars through nucleosynthesis, right? And nucleosynthesis in stars is what produces carbon, oxygen, iron, everything that's a part of organic chemistry, okay? The requirements for nucleosynthesis, it turns out, are very, very sensitive to the values of what are called the cosmic parameters, things like the mass of the proton or the relative mass of the proton versus the neutron and the strengths of the forces holding together the fundamental particles, the subatomic particles. Okay, so I don't know who first came up with the term, but somebody said it looked like those numbers were fine-tuned. So I don't know if your audience, how old they are. Are people familiar with a radio where you actually had to turn a knob to get the right station? Okay, yes, is, and I don't know, I have so many students now who don't even know what that is anymore. But you had to turn a knob to get it just right, and that was called tuning. Or so fine tuning, like you would fine tune maybe a piano or or a guitar string or something to get it exactly right. And that evidence, when the physicists started looking, they saw it all over the place, and these came to be called the cosmic coincidences. Of course, some people said, well, what's the explanation of this? Is it just chance? Did we just get lucky? Or maybe, and this is how the new design argument got going, maybe the universe was planned by a superior being, a God who knew what to choose. Okay, so that's in essence the fine-tuning argument. You asked, I want to say one more thing before we go on. You said, why is it so popular? Why does everybody seem to know about it? And I think there's a couple of reasons there. First of all, there is this frequent image that if you believe in God, you are against science or you're ignorant of science, especially if you deny evolution. Okay, but here you've got science, it looks like it's supporting religious belief, right? So that's going to make it very popular. Now it looks like the believer in God, right? Now that person has rational support for their view. The other thing I think is really significant about the fine-tuning argument, if God did do the designing, it happened at the very beginning of the universe, right? It happened at the Big Bang. You're not talking about God performing a miracle or separately creating species, separately creating human beings. You don't have to say any of that. So you can both say that God is the creator, but also you don't have to say that your position commits you to miracles or to science being unreliable, okay? So it looks like you can have the best of both worlds.
The nice thing about it is that it is not coming from an anti-scientific or anti-evolutionary approach. And the other thing is that there is this shared phenomena between the atheist and the theist. So, and that's pretty neat. And that's the virtue that makes this so compelling to discuss. And let's just go back and could you give us basically the Bayesian formulation of the argument and how it generally appears in the literature?
Let me illustrate it with an example first, okay? It's an example I've gone over in other places. There is a website or a podcast series called You Are Not So Smart. And there's an episode where I say exactly what I'm about to say, where I just explain Bayes' theorem. But basically, okay, suppose you are in the army, you're in the military, and you are in combat against some enemy, and you know that the enemy has two kinds of soldiers, okay? 1 out of 100 are the specialists who are experts at firing rifles from a long distance. This is called a sniper, okay? And the other 99 out of 100, they're regular. They are not very good, not as good at shooting targets from far away, right? So you see a soldier in the distance, however far away, 500 meters, okay? And your person next to you, you suddenly see their head gets shot, right? They get killed, okay? So you have to make a judgment. Is the person who did the shooting one of the specialists, or who is very dangerous, or one of the regular people who is not so dangerous, okay? Maybe it's a specialist because that would be good at explaining this great shot. On the other hand, specialists are very rare. There aren't very many of them. Maybe a regular soldier just made a good shot, okay? What Bayes' formula will do is help you decide exactly how to change your probability of belief, okay, your degree of belief. If you knew that the experts, the long distance shooters, they were 95% accurate, but that the regular soldiers were only 20% accurate, well, you could apply the formula and say, okay, before I knew anything, I thought there was a 1% chance it was the expert. Now that I've learned this thing, I'm going to say it's a 7% chance that it's an expert. It gives you an exact number, right, given the data that you plug in. I think we're actually seeing, everybody in the world, of course, is following the coronavirus. You're actually seeing a lot of discussion of how this kind of reasoning works in discussing what's the underlying rate of infection. And okay, so you're really, scientists are making these kinds of judgments all the time. Statisticians, medical doctors, so forth. Okay, so can I stop? Do you want to hear more about just that, or is that a good enough explanation?
I think we're good to go to the fine-tuning argument.
Okay, so in terms of the fine-tuning argument, I think the argument has really three premises. Okay, the first premise is the probability that the universe is just right for life is extremely low if there isn't a God. That's number one. Then number two, the probability that the universe is just right for life is much higher if there is a God, okay? And then number three, and this is very important because a lot of people let go of it, the probability that there is a God is not nearly as low as the probability that the universe is just right for life given that there is not a God, right? You have to add that extra point, because if I might come up with some explanation of a phenomenon where I say, all right, it's very unlikely if somebody does not have a time machine, but it's very likely if somebody does have a time machine. The problem is, it's still not a good argument because you have to ask how likely is it that somebody has a time machine? So you have to answer that question too. And it's the same thing with the Bayesian version. You have to answer all three. You have to say it's, you have to give a reason why you think it's improbable if there isn't a God, why you think it is probable if there is a God, and then also why you think the probability that God exists and does this is not that low to begin with. Okay?
Right, perfect. So let's turn to one of the objections that has to do with the dimensionality problem. So could you tell
Right.
us what that is and how it is relevant to the fine-tuning argument?
So I always use who is the most famous basketball player? Who do more Iranians know than any other basketball player in the world? Is it still Michael Jordan, or it's still Michael Jordan? Okay. Sure. So if you look at Michael Jordan, he is almost exactly 2 meters tall. Okay. And he is the greatest basketball player ever. Now, if you look at basketball, if he were 1/2 of a meter shorter, okay, think about that. Well, no matter how good you are, it is very hard to be the world's greatest basketball player if you are only 1.5 meters tall. I think even you are probably taller than 1.5 meters. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, that is correct. Yes.
Right, but you're not tall enough to be a great basketball player, right? I don't know. I can't see. And then what if he were 1/2 of a meter taller, so that he were 2.5 meters tall? Okay. There's never been an athlete, a successful athlete, that tall in human history, because it leads to medical problems, right? It's a medical condition, and maybe he could do it. I don't know, but again, it looks like there is a range of 1 meter around his actual height, and if his height had been outside of that range, he would not have been the world's greatest basketball player. He couldn't have been. Okay. Now, of course, this isn't very surprising, is it? Who cares? That's not very interesting, right? But wait, how much is a light year? Well, a light year is 10 to the 16th meters, okay? It's 10 million billion meters, okay? So now Michael Jordan's height has to fall within a window, a range that is 1 part in 10 million billion, okay, of a light year. Well, again, this doesn't seem very exciting, okay? And it might trick somebody because I measured a human being's height in light years, okay? Well, if you go look at the examples of fine-tuning, a lot of them actually have this same problem, okay? So it will say, for example, and this is in my article, in some of my articles, if the mass of the proton had differed by 1 part in 10 to the 43rd power of a kilogram. Well, why are you measuring the masses of the very smallest elements in the universe using a kilogram? That's like measuring the height of Michael Jordan using a light year, okay? So that's a really big thing you need to worry about when you're measuring fine-tuning, is that you can't have the measurement itself rest on arbitrary units of measure, that, because otherwise you could always create fine-tuning just by choosing how you measure it.
Okay, so it would mean that basically the resulting fine-tuning is the byproduct of the units that we have for our measurements. But let's say we take care of this problem as Robin Collin does in his likelihood versions of the argument. What next? Is there a problem there?
So the way normally that you solve it is to talk about what are called dimensionless parameters. So if I have a ratio, I don't know, I know that word translates ratio, proportion, the mass of the proton compared to the mass of the neutron. It doesn't matter if I use kilograms or micrograms or whatever, because the units of measure will cancel, and I will get just a number, and the number is something like 1.000135. And you could still say, if it had been 1.00134, there wouldn't have been any life. And so you might still have fine-tuning that way, and that is in fact how it is normally, how it is, sorry, I'm getting a bunch of emails about homework I need to grade. It is normally about expressed in terms of these dimensionless numbers. Hold on a second, let me turn off my email so I'm not distracted. Thank you. So there you get a different problem though, and this is what is called the normalizability problem. Have you looked at this? There doesn't really seem to be mathematically a way to say, to restrict the range of what's possible for these parameters. And if you can't do that, and this is a long and technical discussion, but it looks like you could always claim the parameters are fine-tuned just by comparing them to whatever range you like. So again, I'll illustrate that with this story. Let's pretend not that you're God, that's wrong, but that you have all the mental power of God. You can think of any number whatsoever, okay? And you tell me, Neil, I'm going to think of a number, and you pick two other numbers. If my number falls in between the two numbers that you picked, Neil, you win. If it does not, I win. All right? Well, I could pick the numbers 1 and 5 trillion, and still the mathematical probability that your number falls between 1 and 5 trillion is 0, because you could literally think you have an infinite number of numbers you could choose from, right? So if you reverse that, whatever range I pick, if I win the game, I can say my winning the game was a miracle, right? Was impossible, right? I could pick the numbers 1 and 10 to the 10 to the 10 to the millionth power. And it looks like I've really chosen a gigantic range, but even then, given your abilities, okay, the mathematical probability that my number, that your number falls in my range is still 0. So it looks like you can't, unless you can put a limit on what the values of the parameters could have been, you can't really say that it's improbable that they took the values that they did. The problem is, how can you say that there's a limit? If you're a naturalist, there is nothing else to put a limit on these numbers, because the universe is where you start. There is no other backdrop or frame that restricts these possibilities. So from the perspective of the naturalist, you can't even talk about the probability, meaningfully talk about the probability of getting a parameter that's just right for life.
Another thing that might be worth mentioning is that when you do Bayesian calculations, you put your numbers in and you get your numbers out, your results. But with counterfactuals, I think that's going to be problematic, right?
Absolutely. You can't say if I don't know if everybody can see me here, but if my hand had been 1% moved, you wouldn't see my face. So there is only a 1% chance that you can see my face. That doesn't make, there's no connection between those two things, right? So yes, you can't automatically go from a counterfactual is what would happen if, right? If the football player, if their attempt to score a goal right? If they had kicked it 1% less forcefully, it would not have been a goal, okay? That does not mean there was only a 1% chance that it was a goal. Those are two very different things.
Okay, so let's turn to the why design question. You have a paper by the same title and see how does that figure to the fine-tuning argument.
Okay, so we just looked at the first premise of the fine-tuning argument. If there is not a God, then it is very improbable that the universe allows for life, okay? My question in that paper was about the second premise. If God does exist, then it's much more probable that the universe is just right for life. Well, why should you think that? And the thing to remember is if the fine-tuning argument is going to be a successful argument, as you said, it's supposed to bring people together. It shouldn't be that you have to already believe that God exists and already believe certain religious scriptures that talk about the creation and why God created. It's supposed to be neutral, okay? So the question is, just from the concept of God, why would you expect God to create? And what I talk about in that paper is there are a lot of restrictions from traditional theology that prevent you from giving certain answers, right? You can't say, well, God created the universe because God needs us. God needs human beings in order to be satisfied because God is lonely, or God needs someone to talk with. Well, of course you can't say that if you're a traditional theist. God is supposed to be absolutely self-sufficient. And so the act of creation is not supposed to be, on many views of theism, not supposed to be necessitated. It's not supposed to be something that God must do, okay? Can you say that just from the fact that God is good, God's goodness guarantees, you're shaking your head, God's goodness guarantees that God will create? Well, there are a couple problems there. First of all, if you say that God can't count as a good, as morally perfect, unless there exist beings that God loves, for example, then you're saying that God is dependent. Not that God is independent, but that God needs us and these other beings in order to have the status of perfect, okay? And that's a problem. You can't really say that. If you say, well, but what if you say, okay, God does need to create in order to be perfect, then you often get the question, and a really interesting book, I don't know if you read it, by William Rowe, called Can God Be Free? In that case, it seems like God can never be satisfied by God's nature is absolutely perfect. God cannot ever stop creating, so to speak, right? So I talk with a lot of younger philosophers of religion, and I've worked through this with them, and I said, it seems like your position is concluding that God is not going to create just one universe, but an infinite number of good universes, and they say yes. I'm really surprised by that. Now, part of that is most of the ones I'm talking with are Christians, and Christians normally say that Jesus was unique, right? The incarnation only happened once. Well, so does it have to happen in other universes? And they've said yes. Okay, so it's a very, very tricky problem if theologically to go say that God, must create because God is perfectly good and God will create all the good universes. All right, so, and I talk about that some in that paper as well. You certainly can't say God did it for no reason at all, because God is supposed to act for a reason, again, on most traditional conceptions, or that God did it against reason. Again, that's not the normal theological picture. If God did do it for no reason, and if that's part of the story, then you can't say that it's more probable that God would have, that fine-tuning is more probable if God exists than if God does not exist, because you just said that we have no idea what the probability is God would create. God might do anything at all, right? Anyway, I really think, I'm not saying my criticisms are the end of the story, but I really think in this discussion between theists and atheists, between naturalists and theists, is there needs to be more of a discussion of the religious side, the theological side. You said what's good about the fine-tuning argument is that there's discussion, but what I find is neither side discusses this part.
Now, one thing which is interesting here is the idea that Greg Dawes in his book Theism and Explanation presents, which is the idea of a spurious unification as, put forward by Philip Kitcher. And Kitcher says, look, if you have this specific state of affair, you have to have from different candidate explanations that you have, the explanation that is specific to that state of affair. So if there was nothing, a word that, it was just God and nothing else, and I ask you, okay, what's the explanation for that? You would say, God willed it. And if there were different words, and I asked you again for each of them, why is there something rather than nothing? You would give me the same answer. So God willed it cannot be a good explanation because of its spurious unification. It basically cannot exclude other potential scenarios from itself. So it's not a good way to go forward. And it seems to me that at some point, negative theology is just not enough. And the theist has to appeal to some sort of divine motivation or intention or something. But you also make an exception when it comes to Swinburne. Why is he an exception?
I say he's the exception, not that I respect Richard Swinburne tremendously, right? But I don't think he gives I don't think his argument that he gives for thinking God is likely to create a fine-tuned universe, I don't think I see a lot of problems with the argument. I don't think it's a great argument. But he comes out and he gives the argument, right? He does not avoid the discussion. He gives, and it's in his book, The Existence of God, right, where he talks about this. And also it's a section in an article he wrote for a book that I edited, a book called God and Design. He has a long discussion of it. He says, it's likely that God would create a good universe. To do this, God would have to create beings that could interact with God, and to do that, they would need to have bodies so that they could learn. And okay, and that's why there would have to be a physical world that would have to be biological. It's a long argument. I don't think it holds up, but at least he comes out and says it. What I said was, the reason I said he was the exception is most other authors, they just say, well, of course, we'd expect God would create, God being perfectly good would, let me start again. Because God is perfectly good, we could expect God to create a good universe. And that's it. That's all they have to say, right? They don't really say much about it, really hardly anything. He at least gives you an argument. Correct.
But there may still be another way for the theist to go on, right? The theist could say, okay, fine, our prior probability is really insignificant, and keep that as low as you want. But then you update it and you look at the evidence. And then our posterior probability goes high. So look how generous we can be and still get fine-tuning out of this formulation. And so basically, there is no problem. But you say this argument doesn't work. So what's the kind of rationale behind your view on this?
Let me see if I can trying to think of an example to illustrate something other than the fine-tuning argument. Let's say you do something unusual, okay, that I can't really explain. And somebody proposes that actually you are an android, created by aliens from a spaceship. And, okay. And the person who proposes this says, now look, I don't know how probable it is that you're an alien android, okay? All right. But it's certainly got to be more probable than this strange thing we're trying to explain, right? So I don't really have to tell you much more about this hypothesis that you are an alien android because it does such a good job of explaining this strange thing, and the strange thing is incredibly, incredibly improbable, okay? You can't really, that's not good reasoning, right? I still need to know specifics about this story that you're an alien android. I don't really know if that's, the probability of that is 1 in a million, 1 in a billion, 1 in a trillion, 1 in 10 to the 500th power. I just don't really know. I can't really get started. And so what I talk about in that paper is there are a lot of philosophers or a lot of proponents of the fine-tuning argument, and they say, okay, maybe we don't really know exactly why God would create a universe with life. It's complicated. There are a lot of questions you could ask, but it's certainly a conservative estimate of that would certainly be 1 in a billion, right? That's what this philosopher Michael Rota says, and I don't have the exact passage in front of me from this paper from John Hawthorne and Yoav Isaacs, I think, but it says something like, well, it's like expecting the world's greatest badminton player from New Zealand. It's something very, 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 very crazy, right? Of course it's not going to be that. But the problem is that's a regular case. When you're talking about God, you're talking about a being with infinite attributes, right? All-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect. God is not constrained by the laws of nature. God determines the laws of nature. So I don't know, if I try to think of what God might have done, God might have created a world where there aren't any material things at all, and it's just spirits interacting with one another. Or God could have set things up so that we live in a computer simulation like the Matrix. I don't know if people have heard of this idea that we live in a simulation, or the point is, I can't even begin to put a number on the possible things God might do because God is unlimited, all right? So it's not really fair to say that we should both agree there's a 1 in a billion chance that God would create a universe that's just right for life.
Yeah, of course. And another thing is that, most theists find the skeptical theism attractive, and that could play a role here, with regard to divine intentions for creations and so on. But let's just put that aside here and turn to the multiverse hypothesis. So why is that valuable for naturalists? And just could you give us a quick rundown of that?
So the multiverse hypothesis is the idea that there are many other universes besides our universe, and that the reason we observe the cosmic parameters to be exactly right in our universe is that, in fact, in most other universes, they are not exactly right, but no one can see them. No observer can observe them because if they're not exactly right, then life is impossible. This is the term, the Anthropic Principle, is supposed to cover this idea that when you're observing these features of the universe, you need to keep in mind that if the universe didn't meet those conditions, you wouldn't be able to do any observing at all. The example that I like to use for my students, and I don't know if there is a similar phenomenon in Iran or not, parkour. Okay. Well, so all my students know what this is. They told me about it. If you watch a video, a compilation of 10 minutes of the world's best parkour, okay, should you think that's amazing? It's a miracle, right? Well, the thing is, most attempts, even for the ones who are the very skilled people who do this, they fail. In fact, they have videos of those too where they hit their head on a wall or whatever. So what you need to keep in mind is when you're watching that video, what does it take for me to even be seeing this video? What does it take for something to end up on this video clip, right? And if it's not perfect, it's not going to end up on the video. So it's not really surprising that you see a whole bunch of perfect parkour. The real question is, how many people are doing parkour? How many attempts are there? When I see those videos, and it's an interesting psychological point, because once you grasp it, it changes the way you look at a lot of things. As soon as I saw parkour, I realized I saw that there were 47 million views of the video as well. But as soon as I saw it, it hit me. A lot more people are doing this stuff than I ever thought, because there have to be, to have so many
successful
clips of these amazing stunts. There must be millions of people doing this to generate that much film footage, right? So it is, in a way, it's surprising, okay, but in another way, it's not surprising, given that there are so many attempts to complete these tricks. It's not surprising that there are enough successes to do a video of them for 10 minutes. There's another story I used in an article. I had this discussion with a friend over 30 years ago. There was an earthquake in Armenia, Yerevan, and I know you in Iran there was Qom as well. And anytime you have a disaster like that, you will get stories that talk about how somebody miraculously survived, right? There was one of these in Mississippi, where they had the Hurricane Katrina. There was the house that was still standing after Hurricane Katrina, okay? But of course, there were tens of thousands of houses that were destroyed, and so we're going to notice the one that it wasn't destroyed. In the case of the earthquake in Yerevan, there was a story about a family who miraculously survived. And I said, well, over 10,000 people, I think maybe 50,000 people died in that earthquake. There was only one family that survived. That's not very improbable, right? And then she said, well, okay, but it was a miracle that those particular people survived. And I said, but you don't know anything about them except that they are the people who survived. So really what you're saying is it is a miracle that the people who survived are the people who survived. That's not very exciting. And she got very angry with me because I was not right. But it's true. It's the same, and it's the same thing. The parkour is amazing, but how many times did they try it, right? Okay. So if you've got that idea, it's the same thing with the multiverse. Just like there have been people who have given design arguments for God based upon that the planet Earth itself is in just the right location, just the right distance from the sun, and it has a moon to give it gravity, to give it tides, and it has Jupiter, other big gas giant planets to absorb asteroids, and all these other things. Well, of course, if it didn't have all of those things, it would not be possible for intelligent life to evolve. The question is, how many chances are there? And if you look at what the astronomy says now, there are, they're called exoplanets, planets outside of the solar system. We're finding that almost every star we look at has planets around it. There are estimates that there are 1 billion planets just within our galaxy that are what are called Earth-like, that they are within the zone where there could be liquid water and that they would have a rocky surface, right? So, and then of course that's just one galaxy. Then there are billions and billions and billions of other galaxies. Presumably the process of forming a star and then planets and planetary disk is the same universally. There were a lot of chances, right? So maybe it's not that surprising. If somebody says, well, yes, but why did it happen here? Why did it happen on this planet? Well, that's just a stupid question, right? Because whatever planet it happened on, that would be the one you said is the special planet. Just like saying it's amazing that the person who survived the earthquake is the person who survived the earthquake. It's just not, you're just not understanding why it's not interesting, right? It's a miracle for that person, but from the outside, is it miraculous that one person survived? No, not at all.
The basic idea seems to be that given enough attempts, the naturalists can account for the fine-tuning of the universe. Now, one thing that I want to mention here is that theism doesn't win by default each time we are faced with something improbable, so long as the naturalistic big picture of worldview can account for them. So by default, naturalism does not say, for example, that the phenomena of, life arising in our universe should be really probable or improbable. It just doesn't have a say here. All the naturalists could say here, could be that if life is going to be there, it has to begin by way of natural processes. But one thing that we have to mention here is a misquotation attributed to you, which is, about multiverse being the last resort of the desperate atheists. And so it's so popular that, it even reached the Iranian theists here. So I was surprised. How did that happen?
What happened was, in my book, God and Design, when I was discussing the multiverse, I said that according to some theists, the multiverse is the last resort of the desperate atheist. So after that, some people, and one particular person, a guy named Bernard Carr, and I don't think he meant harm, but he just used that in a poster and as the multiverse is the last resort of the desperate atheist, and then he put Neil Manson. I wasn't paying attention. A couple of years later, I saw it, and then I started Googling it, and it was all over the place. I had been quoted all over the place saying this. So I tried to track down the people who had said it, and I just said, look, can you please issue a statement that says, this is not my view. I was just trying to represent how some theists look at it. And everybody agreed, right, to change it. But you can't change a book that's in print. Anyway, it's not that I'm in favor of the multiverse hypothesis. I'm not saying that at all. I'm trying to remain neutral. I was just trying to express how other people look at it. And I was afraid a lot of people think that I'm against the multiverse hypothesis, which is not actually accurate. So thank you for making that correction to your audience.
Yeah, sure. But beside the misquotation, there's actually a huge variety of questionable, if not outright false, views of the multiverse. You know, that it is pseudoscientific, that there's an agenda behind it, that we shouldn't take this seriously. And this brings us to your 2020 paper by the title, What Do Theologians and Philosophers Get Wrong About the Multiverse? So I'm asking you, what do theologians and philosophers get wrong about the multiverse?
So what I saw is that there are a lot of I don't know if you have the same phenomenon in Iran, but popular science writers. So they write books that try to explain sophisticated science to an everyday audience. You can actually make a lot of money doing this, right? Some of these books are very popular. You can become a celebrity in the United States. There's Neil deGrasse Tyson. There's a place for this. It's great, okay? But what I think you'll hear is that the multiverse is discussed at that level, and then you'll have, as a response to the fine-tuning argument, and you'll have a lot of philosophers and also theologians will look at that and say, well, they're just making that up. There's no scientific evidence for it. In fact, that's one of the most common objections to the multiverse, is that it's just not scientific. And I think I had some, I mean, of course, that's why I said the multiverse is the last resort of the desperate atheist. That's how these critics look at it. I have some quotations from, even from Cardinal Schönborn, who was the second to Pope Benedict, saying, you know, it's a desperate maneuver to believe in the multiverse. But no one had ever really asked the physicists themselves what their view was. I mean, I don't know if most physicists support the multiverse. 10% do, 50% do. It's hard to say because your only information came from these popular books and popular articles. So what I did was I looked through I did a survey, a global survey of cosmologists in the English-speaking world who were working on, who were cosmologists, but specifically or hopefully looking at these big issues. Because actually, people don't realize cosmology can be a very specific and experimental science, right? You might just be looking at how galaxies evolve, right? And you're not really getting involved with these big questions about fine-tuning. You're looking at this very specific thing, galaxies, and you could be a cosmologist. Anyway, I sent out a survey to 504 physicists and cosmologists worldwide. I looked at the websites of the top research universities that had physics and astronomy programs, and I just got their emails. I made their survey. 126 people responded, which is a very good response rate. Okay, I have no reason to think it's not representative of the group. There aren't really all that many cosmologists, so that's quite a big sample. Okay, and what I found, I mean, I asked several questions in this survey, but one of them was about what the motivation is for the multiverse and whether or not it's scientific. And so what I found is that, first of all, a majority of those surveyed said either it's testable, there's scientific evidence for it now, or there will be in the near future. And there's a lot of, I don't want to get into the physics here, but there are a lot of ways that it's been proposed you could test or get evidence for the existence of other universes, including by looking at the cosmic background radiation. On some views, it's a consequence of what's called inflationary cosmology. There are a lot of different angles where you might think that there could be evidence of the multiverse, and there are a lot of different definitions of what a multiverse would be, or how a lot of different models of what the multiverse would be. But anyway, what I found is that they don't, for the most part, they don't think it's unscientific to talk about the multiverse. Some do, but it's not the majority, okay? And then I asked, it was a hard question to ask because I didn't want to put words in their mouth. So I asked them what other physicists were motivated by, but I asked them whether the discussion of the multiverse hypothesis was, and I had 5 options, entirely to undermine the fine-tuning argument, mostly to undermine the fine-tuning argument, but partly because of the science, 50-50, half each way, mostly because of the science, and only a little bit because of dealing with this problem of fine-tuning for life. And then the last one was not at all because of the fine-tuning argument. I didn't even use exactly those words because I didn't want to put God in the question to make it seem like a trap. So I want to say that the question itself was formulated in a way where I couldn't get I couldn't really ask the question that I would like to ask them, because that's like me asking you, why are you a naturalist? Is it because you hate God? Or, no one's going to answer that, right? So, but what I found is that only one person said that the only reason physicists look at the multiverse is because of the desire to undermine this fine-tuning argument. And then after that, it was about equal numbers in each of the remaining 4 categories. So overall, most said it was either substantially or entirely driven by science, the interest in the multiverse hypothesis, and not driven by a naturalism that tries to undermine this fine-tuning argument for God. Now, I'm not saying that that's the last word. People could do other surveys, or they could, what I would really like to do is have, have physicists sit down and talk with philosophers and theologians, but that costs a lot of money and they've got other things to do, right? What I do think is that for the time being, theists should not be making this allegation against the multiverse hypothesis because they just don't have evidence to support it. A lot of them make this very strong claim. They're basically saying that modern physics is corrupt, that it is claiming it's doing science, but actually it has an anti-religious agenda. That's a very strong claim, and they don't really have any evidence, general evidence, to back up that claim. They maybe can find 1 or 2 people who will say that, 1 or 2 physicists who will say that, but they don't really have any evidence to support that. So I think for the time being, we should take the physicists and the cosmologists, this multiverse proposal as a serious scientific proposal.
And that's why I have such a love-hate relationship with fine-tuning argument. I mean, if you're a defender of it, great. But you cannot, pick or choose which aspect of what scientists are talking about or they take to be serious you could incorporate in your argument and disregard the rest. So the theists should either, put forward their arguments that there is an agenda, or just stop doing that completely. Now, another point that I have to get your thoughts on it is the idea of simplicity. So where do you stand on it?
I believe it was Democritus who said the world consists of just atoms in the void. Okay, so is that a simple theory because there's only one kind of thing? Or is it a complicated theory because there are countless instances of this one kind of thing, right? And where did they all come from? It's the same thing evaluating any theory. Is the multiverse hypothesis, is it complicated because there are trillions and trillions, maybe an infinite number of other universes? Or is it simple because it says there's this one kind of thing, a universe, really, right? I always think that these arguments based on which hypothesis is simpler or has the greater initial prior probability, I don't find them very interesting because they're very, very subjective. I mean, I've got Michael Rhoda, who I mentioned, or Richard Swinburne. They'll say it really depends on how you measure or how you quantify simplicity. There's a 50% chance that theism is true. Just based on that, and I just don't know how to even respond to that. Again, so simplicity is, it seems like simplicity is...
It seems that talking about simplicity, not only can it be complicated, but that simplicity could be, different in the eyes of beholders. Finally, I have to say, if you're one of my Persian listeners, you can check the link in description to read more about the work and the kind of work that Dr. Manson has done on the fine-tuning argument and the translation of his 2020 paper. And having said that, I should say thank you, Dr. Manson, for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to your audience. I hope you gain tens of thousands of followers to follow all the interesting topics you cover.